Route 66 is part of the federal highway system that was designated in 1926 using existing roads. And at that point, Route 66 had to turn north at Santa Rosa, go up to Santa Fe, come on a north-south axis through Albuquerque on 4th Street, and then head west up the Rio Puerco to Laguna. With federal and state funds in the late 20s and early 30s, new roads were constructed and old, just dirt roads were improved in order to straighten out Route 66 on an east-west alignment. That was really opened by 1936, and then formally in 1938, the road that came straight west from Santa Rosa through Albuquerque out to Laguna Pueblo was designated as Route 66.
It's really sort of the backbone of Albuquerque, as I like to say. Albuquerque has good bones, and Route 66 is kind of the backbone. So you can really get a good feel for the city and its history as you drive from one end to the other.
Historically, from Spanish times on, certainly, the axis of transportation was north-south. It went along the Rio Grande. And so with the development and designation of Route 66 for the first time, there was a major east-west axis. In the city itself, what that meant then was that the city grew toward the mountains. It grew up out of the valley and the floodplain of the Rio Grande, which ended about where Interstate 25 is now, stepped up on the mesa and then spread to the mesa. And so a series of neighborhoods, starting in the teens and 20s, the university neighborhoods, Monte Vista and so forth, had already started that process. But when Route 66 was developed, then immediately Nob Hill, Highlands, and other neighborhoods to the east began to develop.
When I grew up along Route 66, it was interesting for me because, I was told, different stories about Route 66, and I kind of have always been connected with Route 66. The story that I think everybody kind of knows and hears is the story of, this romantic idea of sort of, getting away and driving down beautiful, scenery and getting into the open West and things along those lines, and being able to really just be free, and this freedom that comes from journeying across Route 66 and the adventure.
As the city continued to grow up towards the heights, and you get Windrock Shopping Center in 1961, Coronado in 1966, that takes a lot of the vitality and energy out of the neighborhood serving businesses in Nob Hill and the Highland District. They declined pretty substantially.
Well, the thing that you see the most is how that development has happened over time, and then how certain areas have deteriorated. For instance, the downtown was the main commercial area, but in the 60s when the malls were built, the retail moved out of here and really became kind of a ghost town down here. When we first moved in 20 years ago, there were no cars parked on the street, there were no people on the sidewalks, and that's really all changed in the last 20 years or so. But you see that same kind of iteration in other parts, both east and west from here. And what we've been looking at is how to revitalize some of those areas along Route 66.
So why were some of those Route 66 historic buildings torn down? I think it's a combination of two things. And it's primarily the early motels that have been torn down. Those were built by families. Those were mom and pop operations. The motel was just being invented by these entrepreneurs. Oftentimes the construction is not great. It's wood frame and stucco. When Interstate 40 was completed in 1966 through Albuquerque, that of course took all the automobile traffic away from Central, and so those could not continue to be economically viable, the majority of them, as motels. They became medium and longer term housing, rooms by the week, rooms by the month. They became places of, many of them, of prostitution and drug dealing. The city came down on them. In a few cases, some motels were shut down because of that and ultimately demolished. and people just had a hard time finding uses for them that could produce enough money to maintain them.
Well, we just completed a project. It's the Luna Lodge. It was on the National Historic Register. And so our challenge was to take that older motel that was built in the late 40s and convert it into a contemporary low-income housing project with a retail component. And so we had to meet all the requirements of the Federal Historic Organization, and that's the National Park Service, also the state historic preservation. So it was a real challenge to create a new venue, new type of housing, but still preserve the building to meet all the requirements of historic preservation. And that one is now open. We still have the neon sign. It still says, welcome, but we have the no vacancy lit so that people don't turn in there. But there's a whole series of motels that were built along 66, and a lot of them now are either derelict or in many cases they've been decommissioned, torn down. It's just vacant lots in those areas.
Adaptive reuse is when you take an existing building and you repurpose it to fit the new user needs.
I think adaptive reuse is absolutely necessary. I think it should be really the default. I mean, it should have been part of my education from the beginning, because the reality is that this idea of unbridled expansion is actually the opposite of what I feel comfortable with as a human being, as a Navajo, even as an architect. I mean, adaptive reuse, I think, is looking at what's available and not seeing it as something that's sort of trash, but something that has the potential to really be cultivated and to contribute to a different kind of environment.
I think it's actually critically important to teach architecture students about adaptive reuse for a set of reasons. The first is that as our resources get tighter and tighter, thinking about how we reuse buildings instead of scraping them off and building new ones is going to become critical to in terms of sustainability, in terms of economic development, those kinds of things. Second of all, from a kind of more philosophic viewpoint, the idea of how do you respond to existing contexts automatically is part of the problem if you have an existing building that you're adding to. And then that applies to when they're doing new buildings, because new buildings are also in a built context. It's just somebody else's building or those kinds of things. So it makes that question sharper for the students. And third of all, I think that it's related to the second one, but it helps people understand the relationship in between one designer and the next, how you might think about handing off a design. And even in brand new skyscrapers, some designers build the skyscraper and others come and do the tenant improvements within the skyscraper. So there's a kind of handing off there that's a critical part of our skills. Instead of thinking that we're creating the entire world, we're actually more in conversation with the existing fabric, and this sharpens the question.
I've learned that most architects end up doing adaptive reuse. So the possibilities of you designing a brand new building are not very high. You're going to be doing remodels, you're going to be doing adaptive reuse, so it's a good idea to have an understanding and to be able to use what's existing and use it towards your advantage.
It is facing north, which is good for next meeting. It's going to be outdoors. So as I started doing my research, I wanted it to be outdoors use. Like, for example, if you're playing hockey games on it, it has a 12 to 20 year.
Well, this is a classic studio for architecture graduate students. And what that means is they meet Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We all meet Monday, Wednesday, Friday every week for 16 weeks. It is what's called our research studio. So at the beginning of the studio, they researched a set of issues from what is adaptive reuse to the history of the zoning along Route 66, the historic preservation guides for these motels, the actual histories of the different sites, what we call the narrative landscape, the set of stories about Route 66 that might influence how you design. So they all had research projects, and they actually all did little movies. And then after that, I had them do 2 different preliminary designs. And they brought those to a certain scale of development, what we call initial schematic design. And then we chose which one they were going to proceed with, and that went through the end of the term to propose a more full-fledged schematic design.
I'm Cherokee on my mother's side, and I'm Bitotni clan on my father's side, which is a Navajo clan. So I'm half Navajo and half Cherokee. And I grew up on the Navajo reservation, and I'm proud to be Navajo and be able to, be in touch with my native roots. I sort of also had a different story from, the people in my tribe and different tribes connected with Route 66, which, the story from our native perspective is one more along the lines of, incursion of a lot of different challenges that have come with Route 66 as well. So from the native side of the story is one it feels more negative in a certain sense, because there's so many sources of challenges that come with the road and modernity.
If you think about a building being a kind of statement about a way of life, both from the developer, the owner, and from the architect and designers about the way a place should be. This is a great place. That's what we're always trying to do. But there are differences of opinions about that. And they add up to something more. So there's not only my building on the street, but there's the neighboring building and the building across the street, that hopefully those all add up to, say, a classic Main Street or a plaza or some public space that is made by the relationship in between those multiple designs. So that's what we're referring to when we say a conversation. It's between one built form, one design action, and a response with another one. And the response can be polite, it can be great, it can be somewhat sarcastic sometimes. There are all kinds of different responses. I mean, that's part of the decision of the design.
The assignment was to select a motel, and once you selected, to decide what type of program you think would be appropriate for the site. So what I decided was I tried to find the largest motel in Albuquerque, which was the Desert Sands. And I thought that since there was a sea of parking in the middle, it would be a great spot to allow an ice rink and a place for teenagers and young people to spend time there. So kind of like a place to liven up Albuquerque.
The one that sort of started the conversation for me, which was the Alvado. The image of the sort of Lakota, chief headdress as, default Indian was interesting to me, and sort of started the conversation to me. So that began my exploration, and what, I didn't want to take a negative approach. I wanted to look at, well, it's good that, people are interested in our culture. So I thought of looking at it as just a step towards understanding our culture. It was some of the imagery that this is displayed on the hotel is sort of like Kokopelli, and some of our symbols are just used sort of flagrantly and not understanding the real meaning or purpose behind it. And what I chose to do is sort of look at that as the beginning of a conversation, and then maybe, my project was to continue the conversation and to evolve it maybe to a higher plane. So what I wanted to do with this site was to create a Navajo cultural center, in terms of not a cultural center like cultural centers we've seen around, which sort of, put Native people on display, but it's a cultural center where we can actually go and do our ceremonies and do the things that learn about our culture. So if a Navajo child is born in Albuquerque, here at this point in Route 66, and they never really get back to the reservation, they can have some connection with it through this place.
What's going to happen with this piece of history in terms of its built form? Many of these buildings are being torn down. Many are deteriorating. They're not necessarily finding new uses. I mean, some are, but many aren't. It's kind of they're at a critical juncture in their life. They will either go away fairly soon, or they will be preserved, which has happened in a few cases, or more likely, they'll be reused in certain kinds of ways. And in a sense, the studio was an attempt not only to help the students have their education, but to start a discussion in the larger community about what we should do with these. Because frankly, the pure preservation approach has not worked fairly well, and they are in danger of disappearing. So opening up a third path in between demolition and pure preservation, this kind of adaptive reuse, I think is critical if we're going to preserve that aspect of our history. But not just preserve it, have it be a continuing part of our history. It's not something that's just in the past. It's something that was in the past and is now in the present and is projecting into the future. So it's not just a motel, it's now housing for the homeless, or it's an office suite, as we saw in Nob Hill, one that has been reused. Or maybe, as one of the students proposed, changing the motels into hotels, getting rid of the car and thinking of that central courtyard space as an asset for something other than parking your automobile. And I think that, opening the conversation, trying to get players from historic preservation officer to developers to architects, all of whom we invited to the studio, to think about these issues is one of the things that we can do as a university in addition to our teaching.
Let's use that as a starting point. That I'm going to see the hotel a mile away, the motel sign. And that's where the architecture begins for me. That's where the journey begins.
And I would really strongly recommend, set yourself up over the next month to really understand what it is that you want to accomplish and what it is about yourself that you're trying to unlock and figure out.
Well, I hope that they understood this issue of responding to context, not only in the direct way of the adaptive reuse, but thinking about larger context and how this conversation can play and can be part of their skills and can make stronger buildings than pretending that you're not in that context. So that's probably the most fundamental thing that I would like them to, I was hoping that they got, and I believe that they all did, was develop those sets of skills. In terms of the larger conversation in the community, I hope that we're planting seeds. I know that I've done similar projects in the past, and sometimes those seeds take a decade. Sometimes they go more rapidly, but I think by bringing the issue up, by trying to publicize the work, the sets of questions that are engendered by this work, that we will have a more robust community conversation about what should we do with this heritage.